Hello and welcome back, ladies and gents. This is going to be our last video on ancient Rome. I know it was a quick unit, but that's okay because it's there's a lot of stuff to cover, and we're going to be referencing back to Rome in the future as well. So today, what we're going to go over is kind of a continuation or a little bit of a deeper level look into the three sections of Roman history that we discussed last class. We talked last time in a very brief overview about the founding of Rome in its form of a monarchy, the kind of establishment of itself as a power and its republic, and then its transformation and then eventual fall during and after its imperial era. What I want to do to highlight all of those periods is look at three distinct kind of close readings about a couple different events in Rome's history. The first one that I want to look at is from this kind of synopsis or this reflection, historical reflection on the Battle of Cannae. And the Battle of Cannae is one of those really interesting periods in Roman history. And actually, if you're familiar with military warfare, if you're familiar with military history, and a couple other little like battle scenes and all this kind of stuff that get depicted in popular film and television, the Battle of Cannae is probably going to be familiar to you, as we're going to see why in a little while. Now, this is a little bit of historical background. The Battle of Cannae comes about during the Roman Republic, as we're going to see during the invasion of the barbarian Hannibal Barca, the quote-unquote barbarian Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca is now famous and infamous for invading the actual the country of Rome, the Republic of Rome in Italy itself. He famously brought an army over the Alps that included a number of his own men, obviously, a number of a severe military force, as well as a number of elephants, which, at that particular time served as a fantastic sort of one-off trick to terrify the first army that he encountered. You have these like massive creatures that have not really been seen before. It's really an interesting tactic. He goes through Rome for several years, winning multiple different military campaigns in Italy. And Rome just cannot really seem to deal with him properly. It's like one failure after another, or one victory on Hannibal's part after another. And the most infamous failure on Rome's part, and one of Hannibal's most decisive victories, is this one at the Battle of Cannae. So I want to read through this quick but large paragraph, and it kind of summarizes what happens during the battle. So take a look. Rome's response to these defeats, that is the previous defeats of their armies at the hands of Hannibal, was to appoint a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verocchus, Warty as they used to call him, whose tactics, often called Fabian strategy, the Fabian strategy, involved a form of guerrilla warfare. So notice this. The term Fabian tactics, the Fabian strategy, is going to be a very common phrase within military campaigns. It is essentially one of the earliest proto-forms, and some people accredit it as being the first major form of guerrilla warfare. The hope was, it says, to simply starve out the Carthaginians, that is, of course, where Hannibal is from, he's a Carthaginian, by cutting them off from their supplies. But for this bold stance of delaying a large battle, he was also given the name Cunctator, that is the delayer. As Hannibal came closer to Rome at some point, or at one point, he was only about 50 miles away, the Romans became more anxious and wanted to see action. When the term of dictator finished, two consuls were elected in 216 BC, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and an army of an unprecedented size was created to face the Carthaginians, estimated to range about 60,000 to about 100,000 Romans. Okay, regardless of what the figure was, it is clear that these forces significantly outnumbered the estimated 35,000 to 50,000 soldiers under Hannibal's command. Now, a couple things here. We didn't mention that Hannibal was a Carthaginian. Now, the Carthage Empire, or the nation, essentially, was the major competitor to Rome's power in the Mediterranean world. They existed in Carthage, which, of course, is in northern Africa. Now, the war in which they are fighting right now is what is essentially known as the Second Punic War. There were technically three Punic Wars. So that is a war between Rome and Carthage. The first one was essentially a naval war fought over Sicily, and this one was uniquely different because it was essentially an invasion at the hands of Hannibal. Now, the third one, as we'll talk about later, barely could be considered a war at all, and it was pretty brutal. But this is usually the most famous one. So I always say in ancient Roman and Latin classes, if you're gonna create a military sort of movie about ancient Rome, you got to do the Punic Wars. I'm still waiting to this day for at least one of the Punic Wars to be put into film. Because Hannibal is such a fascinating character, and it's such an interesting period in Roman military conflict. So they're chasing Hannibal all around Rome, and they're not able to defeat him. Mostly because Hannibal is essentially a very brilliant tactician, and also because the Romans just cannot get their act together. And the closest that they do to being able to wound or irritate Hannibal is what Fabian describes, which is this idea of like, let's not attack him directly because we haven't been able to do that very well. Let's instead just cut off his supplies. Let's kind of just poke at his men, because we are Rome. He's inside our home. We can kind of control that. So if we do that, we can just weaken him enough that eventually he's going to fall, or we can kind of overwhelm him pretty easily. It's a pretty basic tactic. It's a very conservative tactic. There were obviously oppositions to Fabian, because a lot of Romans did not like that. We mentioned here in this particular historical article that a lot of Romans were nervous at the time. There's an additional problem underneath that, which is the display or the perception of dominance. That Romans might have been uncomfortable with this whole idea of guerrilla warfare. They would have preferred a clear display of strength. They would have preferred the more aggressive move, the more kind of forceful move. And that is essentially what these other two consuls are going to try. So let's see how that goes. Polybius, writing 50 years after the event, and Livy, writing some 200 years later, may well have exaggerated the numbers on both sides. However, still, the Roman lines shammered the Carthaginian ranks in the center, pushing them forward. However, so we have the actual description of the battle now. So we don't know the clear numbers, right, of course, because some ancient historians like to exaggerate things. The major point, though, is that there was a serious disparity in the numbers of the Carthaginians and the Romans. The Romans outnumbered them severely. So you essentially have a battle formation like this. The Carthaginians organize themselves across a line, a relatively thin line. And they hold a couple more reserves of troops in the sides or in the flanks, right? So not even engaging in the lines. They're kind of over here, and they got their major line right here. Now, the Roman force then just crashes into them. So you have this line, and then you have this major force. If we look at it this way, it's a little bit easier. You have Rome's whole force here, and then you have Carthage's here. So they crash into them, and they start to drive them back this way. However, while the Spanish and Gallic forces fell back, they did not break. Dust and momentum drove the Roman forces on, and they did not see Hannibal himself and his African forces at the edge of the fray, pushing in and crowding the troops whose formation and organizations were compromised. Hannibal's superior cavalry defeated their rivals and began to assault the Romans from behind, closing a circle around them. From then on, the battle was an absolute disaster for the Romans, whose large infantry was surrounded and cut down on all sides. Polybius records that about 70,000 Romans were killed and about 10,000 captured, only 3,000 surviving, while only about 6,000 Carthaginian soldiers, mostly Gauls and Spaniards, lost their lives. And, quote, the outer ranks were continually struck down and survivors forced to huddle together. They were finally killed where they stood. So, brilliant move by Hannibal here. Although, a pretty basic move. You could almost say like it's a major failure on the part of the generals, Roman consuls at the time. You have the line of Carthaginians being pushed by the Roman force. The Roman force just continues to push. The line does not break, right? So they kind of encircle them. They allow themselves to be pushed, and they start to encircle them. Hannibal takes his reserves and then closes that loop. So effectively, you have Rome surrounded by Carthaginians. And at that point, all the Carthaginians need to do is just hold out their spears and swords and just slowly keep walking, because now you have an army surrounded on all sides, and we're just going to slowly whittle you down. And as it says, we lose about 70,000 Romans right there. Terrible failure, really pathetic failure, really embarrassing failure. That you're defeated by this ridiculously small, comparatively small force in your own country. So this is a massive insult to the ego of ancient Rome. So in some sense, we get kind of a veneration of Fabius here, because they overruled Fabius' strategy. They didn't think Fabius had a very good idea. They didn't like his whole kind of like, let him just slowly kind of whittle down approach. He was more kind of slow and steady. So, a couple questions about this passage. Number 4, how does the rejection of Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucus's method of war characterize Rome? Well, like we just said, they're a little bit too eager to show their dominance. They're a little bit too quick, a little bit too brutish, and not very strategic in this particular moment. So, unfortunately, the cultures, the senates, whoever it was that was really pushing this, made a mistake and should have been more cunning and more patient and temperate. They should have been able to control their desire for victory in order to really have a decisive victory against Hannibal. Number 5, why would we expect Rome might have won this battle? We would have expected it, of course, because they had a major military force. So we could hear Sun Tzu screaming in the background, right? Saying that, yeah, numbers alone do not win the battle. We need to have a decisive strategy, as well as, a good morale and as a good leader as well. How was Hannibal able to win? Like we said, he used more sophisticated tactics, a little bit more sophisticated tactics. He was able to encircle the Romans and win. What is the so the author, as we said here, implies that Polybius and Livy can sometimes exaggerate their numbers. Now, that of course brings up a whole issue, guys, with ancient texts is how early, and ancient historians as well, as like how close to the historical events are we getting with our sources. We'll bring this up a little bit later, possibly in religion, but the notion of getting a source that is particularly close to the event that it's writing about is very important in historical records. So, for instance, a lot of the records that we have about like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great come several hundred years after those people have been alive. We don't have a lot of direct primary sources that are about those men. Okay. So same thing here. We don't know exactly how many soldiers were at the Battle of Cannae on each side, but all we do know is that there's a consistency among the narratives that we are given that simply says the Romans outnumbered the Carthaginians significantly. Okay. Now, number 8. What general lesson could leaders learn from this battle? Well, exactly what we've been saying, which is you want to be more like Fabius, right? You want to be able to think calmly, discern, in a wise and temperate sort of way, and kind of make the strategic move based on that. Do not let your fears or your own desire for a kind of an egotistical show of force govern your actions. It's a classic example of that, maybe like the classic example of that acting itself out in history. Okay, so that was the Punic War. Now, interestingly enough, there is one more Punic War. It's a war after Hannibal is defeated, by the way. Hannibal does have to eventually leave Rome, and he is pursued out of there by Scipio Africana, and he's defeated right outside Carthage. Now, as a result, Rome has this viciously animus towards Carthage. And of course, I'm remembering I think it's Cato the Elder, was one of the Roman senators, who at the end of every address he was giving in the Senate, whether it was an address about military funding, whether it was an address about sewage conditions in the streets, he would always end with the famous Latin phrase "Carthago delinda est," which is and by the way, Carthage must be destroyed. He always was calling for the destruction of Carthage. Well, Cato gets his wish eventually, because in the Third Punic War, we do see that a descendant, I don't know if it's a descendant or it's another guy named Scipio, does in fact raise Carthage to the ground. They absolutely encircle Carthage and completely destroy the city. Whether they sold the fields with salt, we don't really know that. But the main idea is that Rome does eventually, in the Third Punic War, just completely eviscerate and destroy the Carthaginian civilization. It's just gone. Okay. Now, that was the Republic. Now, a passage that I wanted to give you from the Empire shows a couple different things. This is a passage from Cicero. referring to or discussing the assassination that had just taken place of Julius Caesar. So we know generally from basic understanding of basic popular understanding of the Roman Empire that Julius Caesar was amassing power around himself, was frustrating and irritating a lot of his contemporaries by behaving in a very kind of dictatorial and very king-like and monarchical way. So much so that they obviously suspected that he was going to eventually declare himself monarch or a dictator or imperial, kind of leader or something like this, and they assassinated him. Famously, they assassinated him. All the senators assassinated him, and he is stabbed multiple times in an assassination led by Brutus and Cassius, the two Roman senators. This results in a huge civil war within Rome between those senators and the loyalists of Julius Caesar in the form of Mark Antony and Octavius, Octavius Caesar, who was Caesar's successor, who he named his successor, his adopted, I think it's his adopted son. Eventually, of course, what happens is that the senators are defeated in that situation. So the people who tried to kill Caesar and maintain the Republic were killed and defeated by the imperial forces, the loyalist forces. And then Mark Antony, of course, is then defeated in a conflict with Octavius, and Octavius then names himself Caesar Augustus and ends up becoming the first true Roman emperor. And it's kind of an awkward moment in history, by the way, because when Octavius does become Caesar Augustus, he really does act as a pretty stable emperor and a pretty stable figure and a very positive figure in some sense. He really wanted to make sure that Rome was stabilized and that people felt safe, and that's it. Like he was not as tyrannical of an emperor as most people would expect. Like that, an example that sticks in my head usually is that he had people at the time very clearly writing some propaganda or some criticisms against him, and he didn't usually act on that very much. He was like, okay, he's like, yeah, let them do what they want to do. So he was pretty chill. He was a pretty chill emperor, and he did do a lot of things to improve the state of Rome as well. Now, he's obviously beloved as a result. Now, to rewind the clock, one of the characters that I like to focus on in Roman history, and most people like to focus on Roman history, was this guy named Cicero, or Cicero, however you want to pronounce his name. Cicero was probably the most famous Roman statesman preceding the death of Julius Caesar. He unfortunately is killed after the death of Julius Caesar, in part because of this statement we're about to read right here. He did not like Caesar, as we're going to find out. He thought that Caesar's assassination was a good thing. He was like, good. He's like, I'm glad that he's gone. Unfortunately, what then results from this is that as Mark Antony and the loyalists of Caesar are kind of combing through the Roman people in the Roman Senate, they find people that they think might have been responsible or might have been, in on the job, as it were. And they see something like this, and they promptly kill Cicero. They execute Cicero, and I believe he was beheaded and his hands were cut off and then stapled or nailed in the Senate, in the Senate meeting room. So pretty gruesome end to a very interesting character, unfortunately, but also just a good kind of highlight of what's going on in Rome at this particular time, how it's such a period of serious upheaval. So let's look at what he says. Cicero writes, "Our tyrant deserved his death for having made an exception for the one thing that was the blackest crime of all. Why do we gather instances of petty crime, legacies criminally obtained, and fraudulent buying and selling? Behold, here you have a man who was ambitious to be the king of the Roman people and master of the whole world, and he achieved it. The man who maintains that such an ambition is morally right is a madman, for he justifies the destruction of law and liberty and thinks their hideous and detestable suppression glorious. But if anyone agrees that it is not morally right to be king in a state that once was free and that ought to be free now, and yet imagines that it is advantageous for him who can reach that position, with that remonstrance, or rather with what appeal should I cry to tear him away from so strange a delusion. For, O ye immortal gods, can the most horrible and hideous of all murderers, that of a fatherland, bring advantage to anyone, even though he who has committed such a crime receives from his enslaved fellow citizens the title of father of his country? So what Cicero is basically saying here is, number one, Caesar, Julius Caesar, had in mind the goal of becoming the king of Rome, the king of the people, and therefore the king of the known world at their time. And number two, therefore it is good that he is dead, because that is not an appropriate and a good or a moral thing to strive for. He is not okay with this. He thinks that that's awful, that that is evil, and that that is immoral, and that it is going to take away liberty from the people and the nation. And so it is good that he's dead, essentially. Okay, so Caesar, I'm sorry, being dead, Cicero's like, partying it up as soon as he finds out that Caesar's dead. Now, a couple different things. For number 7, I'm not going to go through the multiple choice here, but I want to look at this question. Describe in at least 2 sentences what type of government Cicero would prefer to the one that rises after he describes. Now, of course, Cicero is going to be a fan of the Roman Republic. He likes this idea of personal liberty, of individuals being able to raise themselves up and, increase their status. If you know anything about Cicero, you'll know that he actually was once a slave, and he actually worked himself up to become the most famous Roman senator, and was actually given the title Pater Patria at some point. So, a very, very accomplished man. And of course, when he sees a figure like Julius Caesar arising, he's really not a fan of this kind of thing because he sees the tyrannical nature of the man. Okay, so he's going to prefer a republic or anything where we have more individual liberty than simple, centralized power. Okay. Now, what is important here is that in Caesar's death and then Cicero's writing and then Cicero's death after this, we see a couple things. We see the echoing of the old cultural laws and desires of the Roman Republic coming into conflict with whatever is now coming down the road in the form of the Roman Empire. We see the erosion of the values in the Republic, giving rise to the value of the imperial kind of power. Now, what is, of course, underlying all of that, or maybe kind of flowering out of that, is violence, ladies and gentlemen, is political violence. There's an interesting way you could track how violent things get in Rome and eventually lead up to Caesar's, assassination. That's not just one of them, but there's more even before that. Instances of Romans, beating each other with chairs during the Senate meetings. This is an indication that things are becoming unstable, that things are going to becoming very, very dangerous in ancient Rome. So when Cicero comes out and writes this sort of thing, he's very much opening himself up, and I'm sure he knew that, to very serious political violence. And as a result, what we get is the establishment of the Roman Empire after a period of severe Roman civil war, essentially. Okay. And I think that's one of the reasons why Augustus is seen as particularly popular, is because he does seize power over the Roman civilization after this period of incredible political violence. But he does not continue the violence. He actually kind of ends it. And he ends the warfare. And he ends the internal kind of strife with everyone. And he brings things back to a relatively prosperous, relatively peaceful period. And he doesn't grasp at his own power in a kind of maniacal sort of way. So it's a weird it's a weird sort of period in history. It breaks a lot of typical expectations that we would have of dictators and sort of things like that. But it's a good little passage just to see what that period was like at that particular time. Now, we're going to fast forward, upwards of like 400 years to the fall of Rome now. So the Roman Republic stays around for another 400 years. And I'm going to jump ahead, actually, and we're not going to read the passage from St. Jerome. We're going to read actually the passage from St. Augustine. Now, I like this particular passage to end our section with Rome on because it's a wonderful conclusion of the Roman civilization unit, and it's also a good introduction into the religion unit as well. So at this point in history, Christianity has been established. Christianity has actually been adopted as the central religion of ancient Rome, the official religion of ancient Rome. However, as you can tell by the date, we have about another, 20 plus years before Rome has officially collapsed. And so what Augustine is doing is he's writing in essentially North Africa, the North African part of the Roman Empire, and he's watching this civilization slowly crumble and methodically crumble right before his eyes. Now, the gravity of that cannot be overstated for what that would have been like for a person like Augustine or any person looking at the Roman Republic at that time. This civilization in the years, if we take it at this year, about 420 or 426 AD, has been around for theoretically over 900 years at this point. So it's reaching its millennia status. The closest thing that we have to that would be something like Great Britain and modern day Europe. So, and even that doesn't really, compare to what this would have been like. There is no civilization around right now that is that old. It's hard to find. There are some Middle Eastern contenders. There's not really that many Asian contenders to this right now. America doesn't even come close. America's only been around for 300 years at best, and the oldest countries in Europe, same thing. They're like, again, Britain would be the closest one. But Britain's influence and power and scale is not, equivalent to what Rome's would have been for these people at this time. So what I like to tell my students is something like this. Imagine America, expand America's history about 800 years in the future to where we control all of America, like North and South, and then we also control all of Europe and all of Russia. Imagine that America. Imagine it's been around for about 5 times as long as it's been around now. So imagine all of our history times 5. So it becomes essentially the norm of world history for 1,000 years. And then one of us is just, let's say, sitting in North Africa, and we're watching as all of it just starts to crumble over the span of 20 or so years. It just slowly starts to decompose and collapse into something else, something completely different. That's kind of what Augustine's watching. So he's watching what is essentially the world of civilization and culture that has defined the ancient world for a millennia collapse. And so what does that do as a result? What does that do to someone's emotions, to someone's comprehension of history? What does that do to their philosophy? It's interesting. It might make you, for example, feel incredibly existentially afraid, because if you, like my students, put 2 and 2 together and realize, well, okay, if Rome could last that long and still have such a dramatic collapse, what's going to happen to America? What's going to happen to Canada? What's going to happen to any of these major countries that we hold maybe a little bit for granted, but are extremely young in terms of the history of their stance in the world? They're not going to last. As history has demonstrated to us, they will not last. Whether it's 200 years, 2,000 years, something will happen. It will either dramatically change, or it will collapse, or it will be overtaken by something else. That's just the pattern of history. It has always been and probably always will be. And so St. Augustine, being a Christian and a citizen of Rome, sits down and writes this work called The City of God, where he tries to reconcile his anxieties and his almost despair over the fall of Rome with his own religious and Christian beliefs. So let's see what he says here. Let's take a look at his first paragraph. He says, God does not raise up citadels of stone and marble for us. Outside of this world, he raises up citadels of the Holy Spirit for us, citadels of love, which could never collapse, which will forever stand in glory when this world has been reduced to ashes. Rome has collapsed, and your hearts are outraged by this. Rome was built by men like yourself. Since when did you believe that men had the power to build things that are eternal? Your souls, filled with the light of the Holy Spirit, will not perish. Okay, so what is St. Augustine doing? St. Augustine is sharing his philosophy with us. And his philosophy is in some sense similar to what we talked about last unit with Socrates' philosophy. Socrates, if you remember, pointed out that you can harm my body, you can harm this physical thing here, but you cannot harm my moral character, my goodness, and my soul. St. Augustine is using a similar principle, but he's kind of extrapolating it to an even more intensely spiritual dimension. He says essentially that anything that we build here in this material world on earth is going to turn to ashes eventually. It will be eroded by time, whether it is our bodies, whether it is our nations, whether it is our artwork or creations, they are going to fade away. Something that will not fade away, however, are our eternal souls, which is our consciousness, our relationship with God, and the goodness that we kind of create and that we foster within our own souls. So that is what Augustine thinks is eternal and what will last forever, not an empire that we create here on earth. So it's this dramatic shift in the ancient way of looking at things. We're going to talk about that with Christianity in the next unit, but it's a good little kind of intro, sampling of that worldview, where we need to stop from the perspective of Saint Augustine and the perspective of Christianity. We need to stop worrying so much about what it is that we create here in the physical world, and considering that to be great and good. We need to be more focused on our fostering and our taking care of something that will last forever, which is of course our soul. And if that lasts forever, you really want to take good care of it, because if you don't, then it's going to turn into something quite ugly. And that's where we get discussions of damnation and hell. So he is essentially trying to shift your attention back to, no, focus on these things that are eternal and that cannot be destroyed and that will always be with us, less so than on the stuff that's going to pass away. Okay. Now, take a look at his last paragraph here. He says, "The city of the world loves its own power. The rulers of this city and the people they rule are dominated by the lust for domination. They seek power to be in control. Those who are oppressed seek power to oppress those who have oppressed them. They strive for success, security, and an orderly life. Babylon and Rome were examples of the city of the world. The city of God, in contrast, has God as the object of its love. The citizens of the city of God live with lives of charity and service towards all. They live with hope as pilgrims in the world." Okay, typical religious perspective here. He is saying this world that we are in is a world very similar, if you want to draw the parallels to philosophy, to Plato's cave. This is a world which is not the whole of reality. This is not the full real world. The true full world is the one that is eternal, the one that is beyond this world, that you need to fix your attention on. Not Babylon, not Rome, but God, but being with God. That's what the city of God is, right? The communion with God. And so he says, therefore, what you should value is not the struggles for power here in this worldly kingdom, here in this kind of cave-like world and reality that you're living in, but you should focus on things like loving God, and therefore, as he's going to say, as any Christian would say, loving others as well, living with charity. That is what matters the most, because that is the thing, that is the sort of stuff that will carry through into the true kingdom, the true city, which is in the world of God, right? The citizens of the city of God, it says, live with lives of charity and service towards all. They live with hope as pilgrims in the world. Okay, typical Christian point right there, that we do not belong to the world, right? We are kind of out of sync with the world. We are uncomfortable with the world. We are pilgrims here. This is only a place that we are journeying through. We are not meant to be here as our true home. Okay, typical Augustine point, that we are meant to be with God, right? So an interesting, a very deep and profound religious and philosophical perspective that I like to point out at the end of the Roman civilization, because it is at once terrifying and just mesmerizing to watch this civilization just erode before us, because it is essentially reminding us, ladies and gentlemen, of our own mortality, of our own fleetingness and our own transience in this world. That whatever you build, whoever you know, whatever you focus on and love materially in this world is in some sense going to pass away. It is going to fade away, as you will. And so what is it that you need to cling towards? How is it that you need to cope with that? Well, the clear religious example and philosophical example that both I think Socrates probably would agree with, and also St. Augustine puts forward, is that you need to therefore fix your values on something more concrete. Not wealth, not power, not lust, not any of these things, not your own ego, but something eternal. For the Christians, of course, that would be God. For all religions, that would be God or the divine. For someone like Socrates, he would phrase it maybe as God or the good, right? Of the state of your soul. That's really what you should be focusing on, okay? So, a couple things here. Some questions. What assumption does Augustine question in line 4? That is, of course, the assumption that these things were going to last forever, right? He says, no, that's completely false. Rome was never going to last forever. America will not last forever. The world, your life, will not last forever. How is he characterizing the city of the world? It is something defined, as we said, by the struggles for power, by the struggles of people trying to get power over each other and all this kind of stuff. That's all it is, that we're trying to just simply one-up each other and one-up whoever one-upped us constantly and without end. Number 4, based on his writing, what does Augustine seem to believe about the things that people build in the world? That they are transient, that they will fade away, that they are not eternal. They are essentially worth less compared to things of the eternal world, things of the city of God. Number 5, what does Augustine seem to suggest people should focus on, therefore? Well, you could phrase it in the metaphorical sense as the city of God. You could phrase it as God himself. You could phrase it as charity and love towards others is what God would want. You could phrase it in the Socratic sense towards goodness and service of God. All these sort of things, these sort of more eternal things that seem a little bit more abstract, but are much more meaningful than the worldly things as he would see them, okay? So those are 3 basic readings about the different periods of ancient Rome, okay? So I like to end Rome with those things. And as you can see, the Augustine passages is a great way to conclude Rome. Now, with ancient Roman civilization kind of wrapped up and concluded for our purposes here, we're going to move now into the next unit, which is on world religions, which will consist of about 5 different videos, 5 different lessons on the world religions and just religion in general. We're going to look in detail at the 3 major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're going to read actually from the direct passages of their holy texts. And then we're going to have a video or a class on a couple different seminars or sort of Socratic seminars on really essential questions surrounding religion that would act as a good example of how we can conduct a seminar and how we can think very critically about the questions and ideas, not only with religion, but with philosophy and all other things we could run into in this course, okay? So I look forward to seeing you in those particular lessons, and I hope you have a fantastic day.